frets, diameter 11. Fifth, you always play with 2 strings, yeah. One string lower. Henry, one string down. One string, oh, string.
My name is Colin Gatwood, and I play the oboe. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a musical family. My mom played violin, my father played oboe. They met at Juilliard in the early 1950s. And in my case, there was always a lot of music around the house. And that's not always the case with some of my colleagues in the Houston Symphony. Some of them didn't have any music, and I don't know how that happens, but it certainly does. But in my case, apparently when I was a crawling baby, I used to crawl into the middle between the music stands of my mom's string quartet and would just sit there in diapers listening to Haydn quartets, I guess. And my dad had a studio up in the 3rd floor of our house where he made his oboe reeds. And he spent a lot of time up there whittling away at his oboe reeds and trying them and practicing. So I just heard music all the time, and I saw them happy with it. That's what I wanted to do. I think it was even before I heard an orchestra or anything. I think just seeing them actively enjoying their instruments at home, I think, did it for me.
I grew up, my name is Bob Dorough, and I grew up actually right here in this house, although not this room wasn't here, but here in eastern Pennsylvania, out in the country. We moved from New York City, and I think we moved quite a bit before my parents came out to live here in this home and raised me in the country. So we had a garden and chickens and horses and cats and dogs, lots of pets. And I also had a very musical and artistic environment. My mother was a dancer, and my father a jazz musician who wrote music. He played the piano and sang, and he was always singing and having us sing. And I'm sure early on, I don't remember what the earliest musical thing I did with my father, but I'm sure it started very early. Or he'd be practicing the piano and he would put me on his lap, and he showed me the white keys of the piano and the black keys, and said the black keys are logs and the white keys are the water, and there's crocodiles, or maybe it was alligators, crocodiles in the water, so walk on the log. So he had me play the black keys this way, which is not piano technique, but I must have been like 2 or 3, so just doing that dexterity, that was something he made up and thought would be good for my music brain. Or in those days, I guess people didn't talk about how music is good for the brain, but I'm sure instinctively, not like, let's see if she can make her fingers just go on those black keys. And I also really loved drawing, so as soon as I could hold a pencil in my fist. He let me have pencil or marker to draw. So I always had sort of a broad interest in doing all those things, drawing, writing, or what else? Well, also science. But one piece of music that started early on was after we went to see the movie Fantasia by Disney, the original one, which came out in the 40s, 50s?
Mm-hmm.
But it must have been in movie theater, and so we went to it, and I don't remember my age, if it was 8 or a little younger, maybe younger, but I really liked dinosaurs, and the segment in Fantasia with dinosaurs is Stravinsky, Rite of Spring. So something of that music, maybe partly because it showed scenes of prehistoric life, dinosaurs. And so, what was that music? And turned out Stravinsky was one of my dad's favorite composers, and I think a lot of the jazz musicians at the time, they all knew about Igor Stravinsky and his harmonies, and they admired the music from the standpoint of the chords and the rhythms, and being so innovative. And anyway, so my dad was happy to play it for me. He had several recordings of it already, so that was the first piece of music that I sort of got hooked on. I wanted to hear it maybe every day, and I got to know it really well as an 8-year-old, and we even got out some 78 records that had Stravinsky conducting, and played those, and so I could hear how, like, oh wait, that tempo is faster than on the recording I'm used to. So I was already like comparing the different performances, how they could sound a little bit different once you knew one. So that started sort of my interest in orchestral music and what you call classical music, but it's kind of a dumb word for it. And later I played the flute because when I was 9 at the school, they introduced the band instruments to the children, and they showed us the flute, the clarinet, the saxophone, the trumpet, trombone, maybe the tuba, I don't remember, maybe not tuba yet, for elementary school, trombone, and drums, and the bell lyre, and you can pick one of these. It's sort of a limited choice. I realize now there was no violin, or thank goodness. Electric guitar. And they also said the flute's a good instrument for a girl, and also the clarinet. The clarinet could be played by girls and boys. The bell lyre, which is like a glockenspiel, but kind of arranged vertically, was for girls. And I think everything else was for boys. But I like to think, although I remember that, hopefully if I liked the trombone, I would have said, I'm going to play the trombone. I'm sure my dad would have let me. Or the saxophone. Mm-hmm. I think the saxophone must have been for boys, if that was one of the choices. And but it did trouble me later when I got serious about the flute and wanting to be, orchestral level player. I was around 16, and And suddenly I was way behind on my progress. I realized, oh, there are other people my age that have already practiced much more and much more seriously, and I'm way behind, and it's very competitive, and that's when I thought, well, gosh, why did I pick the flute? It's like one of the most popular instruments, but something about the sound of it, and just when I started making real progress around age 15 to 16, and the teacher I had, she was a young musician in New York, freelancer, had gone to Juilliard, studied with a famous teacher there, teacher with an incredible sound on the flute. And the sound of her playing and her teacher's playing was really in my mind as the sound I wanted to emulate. So I started practicing more. I started getting better, and I had this idea for how I wanted to sound. I think that was probably the main driver. So I gradually got myself to focus, abandon those other interests, and really do the work I needed to do on the flute. And now I do that as my job, and I have figured out how to do it well and with the minimum. It still takes work, but I've got it down to like the bare minimum. So I've had time to do these other things like the music we're doing this week, and thinking about writing music, and so this recent work still goes back to my childhood, where it was just exciting to make a sound on the black keys of the piano and hear them.
What inspired you to take up the 8-string touch guitar?
I think just I had played the electric bass a little bit way before, when I was already in the Houston Symphony. I wanted to play an electric instrument. My dad worked a lot with a bass player who always played electric bass, and I liked the sound of his instrument. It was Bill Tackus. So I thought, I'm gonna buy a bass. So I went to a music store and got the cheapest one. Didn't really know anything about it. It was red. I don't even remember what I did for an amp, but I just, played around with it, and I didn't really study it, but I figured out some simple things, and I sat in with a band on a very simple bass line, and having a different instrument did inspire me to write songs. I wrote a song during that time, and so.
Who was the electric bassist that your dad played with?
Bill Tackus.
Ah.
I am.
And so I knew learning a string instrument would be something creative, something that would inspire creativity. And it has. And I still find the technique difficult, and but
You've written a
it's
piece.
just a different way of seeing the notes laid out. And the flute has.
You've written a
its way
piece
to-
for it, right? For the touch guitar, correct? Yeah.
And performed it, so that was a milestone last week. So yeah, that's my story.
My name is Daniel Jarvis, and wait, so should I just start saying why I got into it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, I got into music through my grandfather, 100%. He was a musician all of his life, music teacher. His best moment in his life was being a guest conductor for the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra. and you know, he introduced me to wonderful music. My mother did as well, and I got into this particular instrument when I got into progressive rock in college, and discovered Tony Levin and saw him playing a Chapman stick and said, I want to do that one day. And years later, here I am.
So what got you interested in this, well, that's what, the Chapman stick, but what inspired you to take up the 8-string touch guitar that you're playing currently?
Well, that's a good question, because I was kind of wrestling with, do I want the Chapman stick or the touch guitar? And, you know, watching stickmen perform many times, I really wasn't sure which one I wanted to do, and something just moved me to reach out to Stefan, and next thing you know, here I am. I can't really describe what it was, I just know I wanted to play a tapping instrument.
Where do you see yourself taking this from here in terms of your musical development, your musical direction?
I am a massive consumer of music, and that's what I've always been, and I've always been scared to learn about how music is made because I didn't want it to disrupt my enjoyment of my consumption. But I think over time, knowing musicians, I've just decided that while I don't wish to be a pro musician, I would love nothing more than be able to play with other people and make music at some point.
Where do you see music at this point in time, in 2024, and going forward? Have you given thought to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's always been, there's always been so many challenges because of the commercial aspect of it. But, you know, I think that, you know, even with AI and everything else, I still think that people are going to want to make music, and live music will still be a thing that brings people together, you know, in spite of, you know, even DJ culture, which is, you know, essentially somebody throwing a playlist out there. I still think that people want to see live music being created, so I think it'll always be there.
My name is Courtney Vallejo, and I am from Vacaville, California. I grew up in California, and I would say that the way I first got into music was through music played by my parents. My parents don't actually play an instrument, but they love music, and when they were young, really into like music of like the late 50s and the 60s. And then in the 60s, when everyone else was kind of into rock and roll, they were really into soul music, you know, James Brown, that sort of thing, Tower of Power. And that really got me into listening to music from a really young age. And then as I became a teenager, I got a little bit interested in rock and roll. This was the early 90s. And so I thought, it was actually, I think, my dad's idea to play guitar or to try to do guitar lessons. And so just regular 6-string guitar. And so I started on a little acoustic guitar it was like an old guitar that used to belong to my mom, actually. I said my family wasn't musical. My mom did try to play guitar when she was in her 20s and kept it. And so I played that. They told me they would buy me an electric guitar if I learned how to play the acoustic guitar first, and so I did. And I think I learned maybe an REM song or two. And once I proved that I could do that, they bought me a little electric guitar, and the rest was history for many, many years. And then I've always been into music. I worked at a record store when I was in high school, worked there a couple of years, and got introduced to a lot of additional types of music beyond what my parents had introduced me to. And that's sort of where it all began for me as a young kid and through my teenage years.
What styles of music were you drawn to while working there?
Ooh, well, it's funny because I'll go back, I'll go to the record store, but I'll go back a bit further. I loved all of the music my parents introduced me to. Again, which wasn't a ton of rock and roll. There was a little bit in there, but I mean, like I said, soul music, funk music, even oldies. Excuse me, we had a radio station called KFRC, and they always played the oldies, which I love. Doo-wop, my dad loves a lot of that. And so I loved that. But as I got older, interestingly, and by older I mean still a kid, but like around 8, 9, 10, I had a friend whose family was into heavy metal music, like heavy metal of the 80s, and that somehow spoke to my little child heart, which I thought was really funny because I had never been exposed to it, but I really liked it. And then a few years later at the record store, again, this was the mid-90s by then, and so I was very much into the music of the time, like Nirvana and things like that early 90s alternative. At the record store, that was when I more deeply discovered bands like Steely Dan and King Crimson, and just kind of some obscure bands that are, to this day, some of my favorites. And so working at the record store was an incredible experience. I met a lot of cool people and was exposed to music I don't think maybe I would have heard otherwise.
So what drew you to this 8-stringed instrument referred to as the touch guitar?
The touch guitar, this began for me about a year and a half ago. It was early 2023, and I finally decided to pull it together and see a band called Stickmen. And it was a band I'd wanted to see for a really long time, and finally I made it happen. And it sounds maybe silly, but it so exceeded my expectations musically. This performance just blew my mind. I always say it that way, it blew my mind. And I was not familiar with the U8 touch guitar that Marcus Reuter plays in the band. I was very familiar with Tony Levin playing the Chapman stick, and I'd been interested for many years in the Chapman stick as an instrument, but just never moved forward with exploring it. And just everything came together that night. That experience made me feel as if whatever it was I saw, I wanted to somehow try to do that. And so I stayed afterward. They're all great guys, and they hang out afterward to talk with everyone. And I was able to speak with Marcus about this instrument, and they'd mentioned on stage that he created this instrument, and the rest is history. I mean, he told me a bit about it and suggested that I check it out online, and so I did. And I would say maybe a month or so later, I had already placed an order for the instrument, and I've now been playing almost a year, like 10 or 11 months now. The end of September will be a year of playing.
Where do you see your musical endeavors going from this point?
Yeah, well, this last couple of weeks right now, I've been thinking a lot more about that. Last week was my first live performance on the U8, and also my first live musical performance in maybe 27-ish years. The last time I performed, I was a teenager. And I think now I would like to see myself not just practicing the way I have been, but also exploring more writing my own music. I've been very focused on simply doing the exercises and being very focused on like the theory of everything. And I think I need to expand a little bit and start creating my own music and hopefully performing that in a live setting again.
How would you describe the music that you are composing?
Oh gosh, I don't know that it's taken its official form yet. I think you know, with some of the pedals that I use to change the sounds of my guitar, it's fun to explore sort of ambient, dreamlike sounds. And though, kind of back to the heavy metal that's in my heart, I would like to figure out a way of incorporating some of that harder, gritty sound. So hopefully mixing the beautiful with the more heavy.
I was inspired to get into music by my father, who was always playing music. My father was a piano player, and he was always playing songs, and he would sing along while he played, and my mom would sometimes join in as she was passing by. So my father had an immense love of music, but he was also a performing, musician. He played as an amateur in public, but I just remember sitting by his piano and saying, like, I want to understand that. I want to do that. And then I had piano lessons like many students. I didn't really apply myself. I did all right, did better than my brothers. but I was interested more in contemporary music. And so what I did was, in middle school and in high school, I played the saxophone because I had an interest in jazz and rhythm and blues. But what I was listening to was guitar-based rock music, which didn't matter what it was. Could be from the 1950s, could be from the 1980s, didn't matter to me. I just loved the sound of the electric guitar. So that when I was done, when I wanted to get back into music and playing music, I decided to pick up the guitar pretty late, when I was about 19. And so that way I could, play along with my favorite singer-songwriters or, the flashy guitarists that I like to listen to. I could try to learn how to imitate them. So that's where I got into guitar playing. And and in university, I was in a band with my friend, and we had a lot of fun. And so that's how I got into playing electric stringed instruments.
So Eric, what brought you to the 8-stringed instrument that you're currently learning?
Okay. So I was always impressed by guitar players who could do interesting things by touching the instrument. Not just plucking it, but do sort of flashy things by just actually touching the strings. So whether that was the sort of music that Eddie Van Halen made, these very flashy kind of arpeggios, or other people who do hammer-ons and things like that, I said to myself, well, I like the way people interact with the guitar. And there were a number of musicians who played touch instruments who meant a lot to me. And one of them is Tony Levin, who Marcus, our guitar teacher, has played with. And he had an instrument called the Chapman stick, which was based on tapping and touching the strings. And he largely played bass for that. And in Toronto, in Canada, there was a musician by the name of Fergus Marsh. And he played a Chapman stick, and he was the accompanist to the Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn. I really loved the sound of those instruments. And when I came back to music making at a serious level, I kind of wanted to start again. I wanted to put away sort of the bad habits and mediocre things that I was doing. And then what really cinched it for me was when I saw Marcus play live with Tony Levin, and Marcus was playing one of his own self-designed instruments, the U8. And at that point I decided that I really need to get one of those things. Like, it would be a nice opportunity to really learn music again from the beginning and get inside it. And I never really imagined I'd actually be able to, take classes with Marcus, but to my great fortune, it turned out that was a possibility. So I'm very lucky in that response. So I get to study with the fellow who inspired me to buy one of those instruments.
What inspired me? I have to reflect on that a bit. Think back. when I was a child, I would sit in front of the hi-fi player and listen to what my mother would put onto the turntable. Would be maybe Alfred Lortzing, a composer who wrote an opera called Czar and Zimmermann, one of my favorites. Another recording was a recording of Mozart overtures, including the Magic Flute. And actually, it was a recording of the Magic Flute. It was highlights from the opera, and also Puccini and Wagner. I would sit in front of the stereo and listen to it. My parents would wake up, they'd see me sitting there. And I remember that when I was a kid, I used to imagine I could be the orchestra. So I would hum overtures, like the overture to Wagner's Tannhäuser. But in my head, my humming was the orchestra playing the overture, as silly as that may sound. And I know I annoyed a lot of people at gatherings with that. Thinking back on it now, it's one of those why did I do that moments. And then my mom taught me recorder. And then I took up clarinet and was in the school band for a while, and then I stepped away from it for a bit. And when I got back into music, I did the vocal thing. I became a baritone in the school chorus. And we had the opportunity of doing, I think it was the Vivaldi Gloria, was one piece we did, and we did the Fauré Requiem. But the year after I graduated high school, they did Bach, if I'm not mistaken, which I kind of regret that I didn't have the opportunity to sing that. And another music I grew up on was big band jazz. My dad was a big fan of the swing bands. He had a band in college. He played drums, and for that time, but he never took up music the rest of his life. I mean, he listened to it, but I feel he wasn't as deeply into it as my mom was, reflecting on that. My mom always felt that he sort of stopped in the late 50s in terms of his listening. One example, really good example, is Nat King Cole. I grew up on the American Songbook, and that was one of my dad's favorites, but he listened to more of the pop-oriented Nat. It wasn't until years later that I found out what a great improviser, let me just say piano player and improviser Nat King Cole was. I also recently learned about Nat King Cole's brother, who was also a fine singer, when I heard his material. So, there's a lot of catching up I'm doing right now. It's the joy of music. There's so much out there. You can always discover new things. We have on this little small blue globe hovering in the solar system, there's so much here on this planet, in all cultures. But anyway, and around the time that I got out of high school and I was starting to get into progressive rock, in my 11th and 12th grades, I was listening to a lot of progressive jazz, was introduced to John Coltrane's music, Chick Corea, bands like Weather Report, German band called Passport. But when I got to Washington, D.C. in 1975, that's when I got turned on to bands like King Crimson, Genesis, the work of the guitarist for Genesis, Steve Hackett, Mike Oldfield, a composer by the name of David Bedford, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, John Cage, the American avant-garde. And I was listening to the jazz avant-garde side of it, started to find out about like Ornette Coleman and people like that. Sun Ra, big one. I'd always been fascinated with them, and I remember a guy in a record store when I was in high school telling me I wasn't ready for it yet. I was holding up one of the Sun Ra albums, and so when I got to DC, I managed to acquire a bunch of cutout vinyl of Sun Ra records, and I had the opportunity of seeing him twice lead his orchestra, as he referred to it. And it was years later, I had this crazy idea of building instruments. I saw a band led by a Moroccan musician by the name of Hassan Hakmoun. And the group was out of New York, and it was a power trio called Zahar. But instead of the standard bass, drums, and guitar lineup, they used an instrument called a sintir, which is an ancient bass-like instrument, bass lute really, from Morocco. And I got the idea. I went to a local store and I got myself some bamboo, and I made myself a 3-stringed bamboo guitar based on the Zahar in a rough sort of way. And I made it myself, and I started messing with it and recording my own stuff with what I had. I ended up with a small Casio keyboard, which I still have 40 years later. And I was doing recordings at home and driving my parents crazy now that I think about it, because I was always in the bedroom. Yeah, I lived at home. I paid my share of the rent and worked retail, 41 years. Whoa. Not what I intended to do initially, but it was a steady job. But anyway, I digress. And then I learned about the cigar box guitar community and building guitars the way the old blues artists used to do it, including Bo Diddley. One of his first instruments was a guitar made out of a cigar box. You put a stick of wood in it and attach strings to it and tune it to an open tuning like GDG, and you have yourself an instrument that you can sing the blues on. And I started teaching myself lutherie skills. Then I started playing a real guitar. And then I took up this 8-stringed instrument, although I use a 10-stringed version of it. But at this course, I have had the opportunity of playing an 8-string version of the touch guitar, which is the best of both worlds of a guitar and a piano, all wrapped up into one. But it's a mind-bending instrument to navigate. And that's where I am now. The question on my mind that I've been asking a lot in the last few years, really, is why I continuously take the hand of the muse when it's offered to me and join the muse in her dance. My, this is a damn good cup of coffee.
Thank you.